Welcome to the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast.
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 Welcome to the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast with me, Dr. Janine Anderson. Heads up, this show may contain adult language and may mention specific foods. If you find either of those to be too triggering, I trust you to take care of yourself and do what you need to do. This podcast is sponsored by ED Care. ED Care has provided PHP, IOP, and outpatient treatment for all genders 18 and over since 2001. CAMSA, which stands for Connection, Acceptance, Mindfulness, Sense of Self, and Action, is ED Care's mindfulness-based treatment approach and is incorporated into each individualized treatment plan. Facilities are located in Denver, Colorado Springs, and Kansas City, and all treatment is supported by master's level clinicians or higher. ED Care offers 4 specialty tracks for binge eating disorder, elite athletes, substance use, and trauma. And the Connections House, an affordable supportive housing component, adds an extra layer of supervised support. Visit eatingdisorder.care or call 866-771-0861. Hi friends, welcome back to the podcast. Today we're talking with Signe Darpinian about connected eating. Signe Darpinian is a licensed marriage and family therapist, LMFT, certified eating disorder specialist, and IADUP-approved supervisor, CEDS-S. She is also a public speaker and co-author of No Way, A Teen's Guide to Positive Body Image, Food, and Emotional Wisdom with Jessica Kingsley Publishers in London. With private practice offices in 2 California locations, she is able to service both the Central Valley region as well as the San Francisco Bay Area. Signe holds an MA in Counseling Psychology from San Francisco's John F. Kennedy University and a BA in Psychology from University of the Pacific. She is the president of the International Association of Eating Disorder Professionals, IADUP, San Francisco Bay Area chapter, and she serves on the Body Positive Partnership Council. Over the past several years, she's been recognized by various organizations for her accomplishments in women's health and business, while also being requested for speaking engagements at renowned institutions like top-rated Rancho La Puerta Spa in Mexico, Stanford University, and Pinterest headquarters. Her body of work has been featured in various newspapers, magazines, and online sites. She's made several appearances on radio and television in Northern California, including KTVU Fox 2, ABC7's talk show The View from the Bay, the CBS affiliate talk show Bay Area Focus with Emmy winner Susan Sikora, as well as Lady Brain Show with Steve Walton. We're really excited to have Signe here. She's not only incredibly knowledgeable, she's a cool person who's you all are going to have a blast listening to. Signe, welcome to the podcast.
Janine, thank you for having me on.
I'm so excited. I feel like it's been so long in the making, and it's going to be so much fun to talk with you today. So tell us a little bit about your background and your work.
Okay, Janine, let's see. I mean, if we're going to count the really green years, I have been treating eating disorders and disordered eating for, I'd say since about 2001, 2002, so 15 plus years now. And I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist as well as a certified eating disorder specialist. And I have private practices in 2 California locations. So one is in the San Francisco Bay Area, more specifically Oakland. And the other one is in the Central Valley region of California, and that's in Modesto.
And you're a speaker and you're an author. Tell us a little bit about your book. We're going to do a deeper dive into a lot of the stuff that's in your book today, or at least one of the parts of it. Tell us about the book.
Okay, so let's see. A couple years ago, I started working on a connected eating and body positive workbook or guide for teens. And a couple years ago, I was doing it solo. So I didn't really have anybody else on board. And that was going to be just fine, but it ended up sort of naturally kind of turning into a more comprehensive project with with other co-authors with different competencies on board, which I feel much better about.
Yeah. So tell us briefly who your co-authors are.
Okay, so I have Dr. Shelley Agarwal, and she is double boarded in pediatrics, and I actually met Shelley several years ago. She was with the Eating Disorder Division at Stanford, the Comprehensive Care Unit, so we used to share clients and patients. She is still faculty with Stanford, but is now the medical director of a justice-involved youth facility. And my other co-author is a registered dietitian and certified sports dietitian. Her name is Wendy Sterling. And Wendy wears a couple of different hats. So she is an expert in eating disorders. And then she also is the team dietitian for the Oakland A's, which is kind of an exciting time right now.
Yeah, my team's in postseason too. I love it.
Yeah. So having them all on board just makes it a much better project, I think. I love having their piece. So we kind of cover all pieces there.
Yeah. So the book is called No Way, and it's awesome. I was lucky enough to get a copy from you all and read it. And you can speak more to this, obviously, but it is a guide for teens. But I actually think that it is a lot of people who are not teens and parents would really enjoy it too, because it's very clear and straightforward and lighthearted and kind of fun about some topics that can be tougher to tackle. So I've definitely recommended it to some of my adult clients and certainly to family members, even if the person that I'm working with is not a teen themselves. I just think it's broken down in a really easy to understand way. So tell us a little bit more about what's in the book.
Thanks, Janine. So yeah, it's interesting because it was originally meant to be an age group that was 10 to maybe 16. I kind of like the idea of more 12 to 16, but what I didn't really expect to have happen is a lot of my colleagues are using it with their adult clients and even, my friends and parents. And I think you're right. It is because it's made for a teen-friendly, the voice in which it is written is done in an adolescent-friendly way. It is really simple and easy to understand, and we've noticed that a lot of people are using it, not just teens. And it's broken down into 3 parts. So the part 1 of the book is called The Building Blocks, and part 1 is more foundational. So it sort of sets the stage for connected eating, positive body image, and what we call emotional wisdom. And part 1 is about foundational items like, puberty, which is, of course, written by Dr. Shelley Agarwal, and, emotions, the science of emotions and how to regulate them, the stress system, sleep hygiene, and balanced exercise. And so then part 2 is more specifically about the essentials, what I call the essentials for connected eating. And then I know we'll get into that one more. And the last part 3, is more about just adding tools to your toolbox. So, things like, what do you do when you want food but you're not hungry? Or topics like food and body image for special events. And we end with chapters about, what's in it for, kind of reinforcing what's in it for you, not to weigh yourself on a scale, for example. So part 3 is kind of just fine-tuning and adding new skills and tools.
Yeah, I think the book is very well written, very helpful. And one last thing I'm going to say about the book for listeners who may be interested in picking it up is that the book is much shorter. So not only is it easy to read, but it's fewer pages, and that can be really helpful because I know a lot of the times the books that we recommend are wonderful, but maybe you don't have time to read 400 pages of something. And this is a book where you're going to get a lot of bang for your buck, a ton of great information, but it's also not going to take up months and months of your time reading it. You certainly could delve into it and especially take it back with you to your therapy sessions and work on some of those concepts. But I love that about this book too, is that, even myself, I'm not always looking to pick up a textbook to read. Sometimes I just want good info pretty quickly. So I love that about it. Let's talk more about your section of the book. Today, we're talking about connected eating. So what is connected eating? What are the parts of connected eating?
Yeah, connected eating. I remember hearing the term. There are a lot of really great terms for connected eating, but I like connected eating specifically. I remember actually reading about it in a book that was written in the 90s, which is an oldie but goodie called Moving Away from Diets. I don't know if you remember that book, but they talked about connected eating as well as healing from disconnected eating. And so, yeah, I always liked that. The connected eating, or the essentials for connected eating, it first starts with making foods equal in availability. And I thought of an example that you'll like, Janine, and it's kind of perfect for this time of year, given that we are approaching Halloween. So making foods equal in availability is not a guideline, a connected eating guideline that I had really thought of until I started experiencing it firsthand. What it basically is about is, let's say that you have a day full of therapy sessions, and you don't necessarily have your lunch scheduled, and you're supposedly going to, head toward your kitchen at the office or your little refrigerator and your 10-minute breaks in between sessions, which don't seem to really exist, but sometimes they do. Yeah, I don't know. The 10-minute break in between session. Interesting.
I run to the bathroom and then I run right back. All my clients tease me about it. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, and I think side note, I think we do better therapy when we actually make the time to run to the bathroom. I give better advice. I'm sure you do too.
I do.
Taking time for a snack or using the restroom, those foundational items lend themselves to better sessions. So anyway, you'll appreciate this. It really struck me a few years ago when I had brought my daughter's leftover Halloween candy into my office, and I had it in the fridge at the office there. And I also, at the time, remember specifically having the makings for a sandwich. So, I had not taken the time to put the sandwich together and assembled an actual sandwich, but I had maybe lunch meat and cheese and condiments and bread. I had everything there to make one, but it wasn't made. And I had a bag full of Halloween candy, and I'm not messing around. I mean the good stuff. So I run in there sort of in crisis mode, trying to grab a little snack, to go back into session. And what I found is that I would inevitably end up grabbing what was easiest versus what my body was actually calling for. So, I don't know about you, but when I'm hungry, when I definitely have clear signs of appetite, and I know that shows up a little differently for each of us, and we'll talk more about appetite, but when I'm legitimately hungry, I'm not necessarily craving candy. I'm craving something with a little more substance, something with some fat and some carb and some protein, something hearty like a good sandwich. And then maybe a piece of candy afterward, but I'm not typically craving candy. So I realized I'm actually pulling what's easiest versus what my body's calling for, and it just got me thinking about, what does a connected eating refrigerator actually look like? So ultimately, although it's not as simple as it sounds, a connected eating refrigerator would have things prepped, so I would have sandwiches halved and ready to go, cheese sticks, cubed up fruit. The Halloween candy would still be there, but there would be lots of different choices. And so my decision would then be more based on what my body's calling for versus what's easiest.
Yeah, I love that point. And I just want to speak a little bit to the idea of meal prepping, because I think that the idea of meal prepping should be neutral. That should not be a diet thing. And I think that there's a way to do that has nothing to do with dieting. So virtually every Sunday, I prep different food throughout the week, and it's based on me knowing what my schedule is, specifically my work schedule, because at the end of a day, I don't want to go home and cook for any more than 30 minutes. And sometimes I don't even want to do that. So there's a way, I think, in which people can use meal prepping as a way to restrict, to limit yourself to only having certain foods. You're just going to stick with whatever you've put in that container. Versus I'm planning to not have enough time and emotional energy to cook something more in depth or advanced. And I tend to do that, tend to cook bigger meals or meals that take more preparation on the weekends or on Thursdays when I work from home. So it's not about this dieting and fear of this food, but you're speaking to how paying attention to our needs lets us know what kind of preparation we need. And sometimes we just need to have a sandwich prepped.
Right, exactly. And I don't seem to enjoy cooking very much. That doesn't appear to be happening for me. And so it's not looking good so far, Janine. It's the joy of not cooking. And so for me, I have to get sort of crafty at places, like Trader Joe's, for example, that have like easy to grab things, and I'll stack those up, stock them up for my big, long therapy days. But I will make sure to add things like, I'm not at all demonizing Halloween candy. I often, like to have something sweet. So I'll throw that in there too and just try to anticipate. It gets a little hard, though, to anticipate your food's needs for that particular day. So there's a little trial and error, but I try to remember, I just kind of base it on foods that I like. And if I don't succeed at packing the right amount, then that kind of determines what I'm up to on the way home. One day a week, I drive home from my office in the Central Valley back to my office in the Bay Area. So trial and error, but there are definitely ways to meal prep. But like you said, meal prepping has gotten a little bit of a bad reputation. We don't mean it in a diety way. It can look different whether you like to cook or you do not. I mean, it can happen, in both ways.
Yeah. So the first part of connected eating, making foods available. What's next?
So this is a perfect segue into the next guideline, which is learning the hunger meter. So I'm going to kind of blend the hunger meter that we use with eating with manageable hunger. So I'm going to combine those two. But the hunger meter that we use is a pretty common hunger meter. And so basically it's 1 to 10. And there's a nice visual for it in chapter 7 of the book. And 10 would be the high end of satiety. So a 10 might be Thanksgiving stuffed. And a 1, in contrast, would be the low end of hunger. And so a 1 would be ravenous. So ideally, you want to eat to appetite, which we're defining, or with manageable hunger, which I think is key. And we're defining that as a 3 on the hunger meter. Okay, so if 2 and a 1, you're getting ravenous. Your need for food, it's getting pretty pronounced on your mind. That would be a 2 or a 1. But a 3 would be kind of like your first hit of hunger, when you're getting that first subtle sign, however you receive that signal that it's time to eat. And so what I notice is that, for example, I'll stay with this trend of making foods equal in availability. So let's say that I do my best to pack my food for the day, long caseload day in the Central Valley. And let's say at the end of the day when I'm ready to drive home and I have like an hour and a half drive, let's say that if I'm at like a 3 on the hunger meter, and let's say, for example, that I'm going to go get a burger on the way home. Okay, so maybe I didn't pack enough for my dinner on the way home, but I'm going to go get a burger. If I go get a burger and I'm at a 3, it feels more peaceful. So that's what we're calling manageable hunger. So I can really easily identify what sounds good. So when I'm at a 3, I can tune in and decide from the inside. And I have clients thinking of using something called the 3 T's. So the 3 T's stands for what taste, texture, and temperature do I want my food to be?
Ooh, I love that.
And so, taste, texture, and temperature. And so if I'm at a 3, I can kind of tune in and decide from the inside, identify what food I'm craving, and I can very peacefully order an amount that I know will take me to a nice stopping place. So it just feels like there's more of a choice. I can grab exactly what it is that my body's calling for. It's pretty easy to stop at just enough, and I can move on. Whereas if I somehow didn't do a great job packing, and when I get back in the car, I find myself more at a 2 or a 1, and let's say that I go to the same hamburger place, it's more frantic. And so my eyes sort of like, figuratively speaking, do get bigger than my stomach. And so I'll order 1 of everything. And as you and I both know, when we're extra hungry, below a 3 on the hunger meter, the ghrelin, the hunger hormone, gets way more intense. And I always find this interesting. This is in Dr. Linda Bacon's book, Body Respect. I think it's in there. What's always interesting to me is that when we get extra hungry, it actually kind of opens our taste buds up more than usual. So we'll find that we like things that we might not ordinarily like, which is the body's just like fascinating with its self-regulatory system. And so if I go to the same burger place and I'm at a 2 or a 1, I will order 1 of everything, or much more than I might normally. And it'll be much harder to stop at just enough because when we get extra hungry, our satiety hormone leptin is also weakened. So anyway, it's a pretty big difference in how I arrive somewhere, how we all arrive somewhere, where we are on the hunger meter. It has a lot to do with what we end up eating and how much of it.
So we're trying to aim for staying kind of within the middle of that hunger fullness meter, because that's the most moderate, kind of peaceful place to be when we're eating foods and figuring out when we need to stop.
Exactly. So we kind of aim for a 3. So sometimes I say the goal is to 3 to 6 it. And the thing is, though, yeah, sure, if we eat to appetite or we eat with manageable hunger, it is going to be a lot easier to stop at just enough. But I also want to make sure that I make it really clear to the audience that, we could turn this whole connected eating thing into a diet in a nanosecond if we didn't normalize overeating or eating without hunger or getting too hungry.
Yep.
Yeah, so we're just kind of aiming for starting at a 3, stopping at just enough. And if we eat more than what feels comfortable in our body because the cookies were extra hot and just came out of the oven, so what? Big deal. So the goal is to just kind of cultivate curiosity, like, oh, interesting. I ate to about an 8 or a 9 on the hunger meter. I see. It's because I let myself get too hungry. Okay, log it in, put it in the rearview mirror, move on.
Right. Happens to the best of us. That's part of, I would say, normal eating. And I know normal eating's not, people take issue with that phrase, but I think that happens to people who do not have eating disorders and who are recovered. So part of it.
Right. I guess you could say, I'm sure you would agree with this, it's not normal to always eat with hunger and always stop at just enough. That's not normal. I mean, we're dealing with we've got the season changing right now. That's going to affect our food and the foods that we're craving, in our 3 Ts. We have situational things that are happening in our lives that make us a little more emotional, and food is inevitably going to get hit a bit there. Hormonal fluctuation, all kinds of things going on. And so our food is always just sort of moving around. And yeah, all right, we're kind of aiming for appetite and stopping at just enough, but the goal is to just cultivate curiosity about what you're up to, log it in, move on.
Yeah, tell us about another part of this, which is legalizing all foods or making all foods fair game, and why that's so important.
Say we're at that 3, we're at the manageable hunger. We have an opportunity to tune in and decide from the inside. And so we do our 3 Ts. What taste, texture, temperature do I want my food to be? Today, for example, I decided, I'm going to have butter with scrambled eggs and make them really cheesy in a flour tortilla. So let's say that I identify that's the food that sounds really good to me. And let's say that organically, that's the hit that I get after kind of identifying what my body's calling for within reason for what I have in the fridge. Okay. So I identify what my 3 Ts are and what it is that I would like to have. But let's pretend that I then come in on myself. I have a secondary response to the food choice that I've come up with. And I tell myself, hey, you know what? Cheese is fattening and this is a flour tortilla, and if you have that, this and that, I don't even want to say what, but I don't want to give anybody any ideas, but you get the idea. So let's say that I have a secondary response to that initial craving, the thing that sounds really good. What happens is that, and I think Dr. Anita Johnson does the greatest job at identifying this. She says, well, basically, if you identify that there's a particular thing that you want to eat, but then you tell yourself you can't have it, like you're not to be trusted, say, with this particular food, or you shouldn't be having it because of this or that, then basically what it does is it activates your inner rebel. And, so activating that inner rebel is really, really cool for other things. Like setting really appropriate boundaries with people or speaking truth. There's lots of great things that our inner rebel can be good for.
Sure.
But we don't really want to activate that part of us as it relates to food. Another example might be, I think there was a client that shared this example with me where she was like at a coffee shop. She walked in and she got sort of beckoned, by the croissants and the pastries in the case at the coffee shop. I think it was a croissant, and she says, a croissant sounds really, really good to me right now. But then she comes in and has a secondary response to that craving that just sounded delicious. She says, no, you've got this event coming up, and you can't have a croissant because of whatever. So basically, when we do that to ourselves, first of all, it implies that we are not to be trusted. And that's just not true. That's not universal truth to begin with. We are to be trusted. And then secondly, it backfires. So what happens is it's kind of like telling yourself, to not think about purple elephants.
Right.
And if you try to do that, if you try it experientially and you try to do that you tell yourself, do not think about purple elephants, and then try it for about 60 seconds, you're going to be thinking about purple elephants. But back to the croissant, if you tell yourself that you can't have the croissant because you're not to be trusted or this or that is going to happen, it's like you're going to end up having a couple of croissants. You see?
Yeah.
So it really backfires.
Yeah, and I would also say, even if your inner rebel is activated and you don't eat more in quantity, like let's say that you have that reaction and you eat one croissant, I just think that it's not as enjoyable either because the judgment is in there. Yeah.
Right. Then you take the pleasure away,
Yeah.
And then it also sets you up. It sets you up if you're not allowing yourselves to have certain things and your food isn't pleasurable enough, you're setting yourself up to overly respond to special food or fun food.
Right.
So if I'm allowed to have cake anytime I want to have cake and I really kind of save it for the kind of cake that I like, then I'm not really going to mess around from the kind that comes from the grocery store. I'm going to wait for the really good cake and I'm going to eat it with appetite or without, stop it just enough and eat it with pleasure. So it sets people up to overly respond to foods that they're not allowing themselves to have, which is tricky because then they sort of blame it on the food. Oh, yep, see, I can't have cake because I just ate a whole bunch of it. When in reality, allowing yourself to have the cake really kind of takes the air out of cake.
Right. Or just, what people will say is, oh, I'm addicted to blah, blah, blah food. And it's like, well, a lot is going on there and maybe the way that you interact with that particular food. So I always recommend that people try to sort that out before they leap to blaming it on the food itself. I wanted to talk with you about eating emotionally or emotional eating. And I feel like a lot of people can connect with that phrase and I like it in a lot of ways, but then I also think it's very misleading in some ways because emotions are part of eating and are part of a really healthy and joyful relationship with food. So I kind of wanted to hear your thoughts on when does eating emotionally become problematic and what can we look out for with that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I agree. And one other thing I'd add to it, and I'm sure this is also what you mean, I think we're used to thinking of emotional eating as connected to negative emotion, but I don't know about you, but there are plenty of times that I have really happy emotion and I'm eating,
Yes.
because of it. So it's not just emotion that's identified as negative. In my opinion, it wouldn't be normal to not eat emotionally. And that's what, you and I were talking about. We're going to be curious about it, but we're also not going to demonize eating without hunger and maybe for emotional reasons. We just want to be awake and aware of when we're doing it and why. So I guess if we find emotional eating becomes problematic, and tell me what you think about this, it becomes problematic if it's the only way that we're managing emotion.
Yes, I always tell my clients the only way or even the primary way. I think that can be kind of upsetting too.
That's a great way to phrase it, a primary way, right. And so if we find that we're eating emotionally in a problematic, more chronic, more habitual way, however you want to phrase it, then that's a different piece. There are some techniques that I use for emotional eating if somebody has identified that the emotional eating is problematic and happening, like you said, as a primary way to manage emotions. Do you want me to? Would that be
tell us about that.
Okay, so there are a couple of ways that I address it, and what I do is if somebody comes in already identifying, say we've already identified that the emotional eating is more like in the problematic zone or even maybe binge eating, somewhere in there, what I'll do that's DBT informed is initially I will have them work on, the first stage, which is skills acquisition. So I'll have them do, quite a bit of reading about it. And then skills strengthening through emailing me in real time for a very temporary kind of first stage. And when they're emailing me in real time, it doesn't mean that I'm always responding on the other end. It's just that we're kind of doing that piece. We're kind of increasing the support initially. And then, of course, it's not meant to stay that way because I don't want them to become dependent on therapy. But here's an example. I know, that would keep my caseload really full. So here is one exercise that I really like to do. So what I'll do is I will send the client an image of the hunger meter, which is really helpful to people initially. So they'll have that hunger meter that's in Chapter 7 that I talked about, that's 1 to 10, and they can see it visually. And I'll have them first, so if they're having a pull toward food, I'll have them first kind of be thinking about, where are you on the hunger meter? And at first, that's pretty confusing, by the way. Unless the cues, hunger is a really loud signal and obvious, right? And so it's super stuffed. But the gradations in between are pretty subtle and hard to identify. So it takes a while to get really comfortable with knowing where you are on the hunger meter. But I explain that up front. And so I'll first have somebody be checking in. So say that this is what we're doing for homework. We've identified that this is what the person, I'll always ask clients after the first couple of sessions, and I ask it pretty regularly throughout our therapy together. Well, so how do you want to feel differently? Or how do you want to behave differently, think differently? So if the client says to me, I want to behave differently in that I want to eat more normally, sometimes eating without hunger, other times eating with or without, but not in I don't want to use it as my primary way to manage emotion. So we've identified that that's how they want to be different. What I'll do is have them identify so for homework in between, if they're emailing in that very first temporary stage, they'll identify where they are on the hunger meter. And let's say that they are positive they're not hungry. So they just had sort of a nice-sized meal, but they're feeling kind of neutral, maybe at a 5 on the hunger meter. A 6 is what would be satisfied. I'm defining as satisfied, room for more, comfortable stopping place. But let's say that they don't feel any hunger at all, but they're just kind of at a nice place at a 5. So first they identify that they're a 5 on the hunger meter, and then I'll have them, when they're feeling the pull toward food, but they're sure that it's not with hunger, I'll have them do a technique called creating space between them and the non-hunger eating. And what I think is really important about this tool in the beginning is that the target behavior is not whether or not they end up eating the food. The target behavior is creating space between the client and the non-hunger eating. And a lot of times I'll say to them, I'm like, I'm not even really interested in whether or not you ate the food or not. I'm more interested in what is going on in that space between you and the food. So they may write to me and say, I'll have them do different techniques. Some of them use a deck of cards called the Mixed Emotions deck of cards. And so some of them will just kind of put down every card that it is that they're feeling so they can get really good at labeling different emotional states. And as we know by now, it's pretty well documented that those who are able to label their emotional states are also some of the most regulated individuals. So the ability to label what's going on for you does kind of decrease that emotionally aroused state a bit. Doesn't take it away entirely, but it can kind of bring it down a little bit. So whether they use the cards for visuals, if they're first kind of learning what it looks like and they need those visuals, or they may tell me what's going on. So what thoughts do they notice? What bodily sensation do they have? What it is that they're feeling? So they'll create that space, tell me what's going on, and what it ultimately does, it starts to kind of create some distance between a feeling, whether it's a positive feeling or a negative feeling, and an immediate response for food. So it kind of it sort of starts to wither that groove away, so to speak, and kind of create a little space from that knee-jerk reaction. And one way to think of it is, I remember reading this in a book about self-injury where they were talking about how the brain makes the strongest connections between things that happen close together in time. So I thought it's such a lovely way to say it. So if you think about it, if every single time I am stressed or a client is stressed, they eat emotionally as a way to regulate the stress, well, then over time, a feeling of stress will naturally generate an urge for food with or without hunger. And so those two get paired together over time.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
That makes so much sense. I was just thinking of all the people that I work with who could definitely relate to that and how, in the past, I can totally relate to that too. And I was also thinking about how it kind of reminds me of a lot of the concepts in ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, which are about mindfulness and kind of separating from some unhelpful thoughts, like oh, I'm feeling upset, I should eat something right now, that sort of thing, like creating that space. And I just think that that's such a helpful concept to put a pause in there, whether you end up eating or not.
Yeah, that's a great point, Janine, because it reminds me too, it sort of naturally lends itself to diffusion.
Yes.
The ACT therapy skill of diffusion. So instead of fusing those two together, stress and food, stress, food, stress, food, it diffuses them. And sometimes it might be food and other times it might not be. But to me, it's really important that the clients know, and it's hard for them to not put this piece together because they don't feel as successful at this skill in the beginning if they're not able to not eat the food. So they kind of want that to be happening first. It's our job, right, to catch them doing something right and to remind them that we're going to get a lot further with this strengthening this particular target behavior without the focus on whether or not they end up eating. So it's kind of like the formula. It's the awareness plus action that equals the change.
Right, definitely.
They want the change first, but that awareness piece is like, it's so important.
I want the change first too, but it doesn't go that way.
I want it too. I want it too. And I heard this one time in a yoga class where the yoga teacher was saying that, change, the real sustainable kind is like a cargo ship making a right turn.
Whoa.
So it takes a lot of practice.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about what people can do when they are creating that space, when they're putting that pause between an emotion that feels uncomfortable for them and that urge to eat if they're not physically hungry. Like, what do you do with the feeling?
Okay, so yeah, that's a great point. So that's one technique that we just covered off on where they can kind of email in real time as it's happening to practice the skill set in their environment, maybe like in the evening when there's more of a conditioned response to eating at a particular time of night, for example. And it's an interesting thing because when they start getting more practiced, more skilled at creating a space between them and the non-hunger eating, then it's kind of figuring out, well, gosh, what is my foodless fulfillment? So what do I like to do? Because food is getting, if somebody's doing it more chronically, right? Mm-hmm. Food is getting used for a lot of things. It's getting used for bored. It's getting used for tired. It's getting used for reward from a long day. And so it's sort of interesting to figure out, like, gosh, what lights me up? What ignites me other than food? So what is my foodless fulfillment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that ties back into what was said earlier about when food is the only coping skill that you use or the primary one. Like I say, we want to have a variety of things that you can go to instead when emotions are hard to hold.
Yeah. And, in chapter 11, it's the chapter about, what to do when you want food but you're not hungry. We pulled in a couple of different experts. So one was my colleague, Margaret Hunter, who has a section on art therapy. And so she calls it habit reversal with art, redesigning your relationship to food. So that's one example about having like a craft table with things that, I have one client that's really into making stained glass. That's the art project that she's into right now. And so, really investing, if it's possible, in the materials that she needs to do that project and have, I never thought of this, but to also have those art supplies equal in availability.
Right.
Out and yeah, that's a cool, thanks, Janine. But anyway, having it equal in availability and out and ready to use. So she's got a really cool section in there. And then I also had the opportunity, so Dr. Timothy Walsh from the Columbia University Eating Disorder Division was generous enough with his time to talk to me about other ideas for habit reversal. And he used an example. So let's say, again, that the food is more in habit mode. Okay, so again, we're not talking about just normal eating without hunger and beyond satisfied, but it's more of a habit. He used this example. He said, so say that you have this young boy and when he comes home from school every single day, let's pretend like the kid isn't hungry after school because that's not usually the case, but let's pretend that he has a really hearty snack before he comes home and he has no hunger. Okay, let's make that up. So he comes home and he has no hunger, but every single day he has this gigantic bowl of vanilla ice cream. So our clue there, right, is that it's the same flavor every single day. It's at the same time every single day, and it's without hunger. So that makes us think, that's probably more in the habit zone than it is connected eating. So Dr. Welch talks about when you're doing habit reversal, initially, the goal is to replace the old habit with a new habit that is somewhat rewarding. So, we can't have like Johnny come home from school. We're not going to replace his vanilla ice cream with homework. Yeah. Hey, Johnny, instead of that vanilla ice cream, it's homework time. What do you think about that? It's not going to work. And so he said, what if Johnny came home, and again, he's not hungry, okay, so I don't want anybody to think that we're depriving this kid. But let's say he comes home, and instead of the big bowl of vanilla ice cream every single day, we give him an apple, and he has 30 minutes to watch TV. So it's replacing the old habit with a new habit that is somewhat rewarding. But I got to say, it's hard to compete with food. It's hard to, and especially, when you're kind of in the stage of resetting their set point, it's hard to replace food with, knitting initially, but over time it works.
Yes, definitely. I always tell people that too, and you're speaking more toward habitual eating when you're not hungry, but I think this is true definitely for eating disorders or disordered eating. But I always tell people, I don't think any habit or craft or hobby that you pick up is going to replace the eating disorder. Like no one's ever started knitting and been like, wow, I don't need my eating disorder anymore.
Right.
But I think it's all about the combination of building up little things that can be used as coping skills, as well as things that are just part of enjoying your life, activities that build up your life. That way, all of your thought process and all of your heart isn't about obsessing over food and what you do and don't do with food.
Exactly. And the food, if it's in the habit zone and there's a problem, it's tricky, right? Because it's like counterfeit pleasure. So it's the kind of thing, which I define as anything that is really great in the moment, but doesn't feel that great afterwards. So it doesn't have a very prolonged state of well-being. And so it gives you that initial bang for the buck, and it does the job really temporarily, but then right when the bowl of ice cream is done, then you're back to where you started. So it's the way that I feel about yoga. I'm typically, sort of looking forward to pigeon pose, which in our class is a sign that it's coming to the end. But I know I'm like, yay, I really do love, it is joyful movement for me, but it doesn't mean I'm loving it the whole hour and a half,
Right.
And it also depends on the state that I'm in when I'm in there. First of all, I typically like to go, or I don't go, and then it not only feels good while I'm doing it, but it carries me. I mean, I can feel the benefits. It has such a prolonged state of well-being, whereas things that are more in the counterfeit pleasure category, they just don't. They don't really benefit us much when they're done. So then it's tricky. It's the idea of you can't ever get enough of what you don't actually need in the first place. And so then the minute that the bowl of ice cream is gone, then you're kind of feeling a pull toward another one because it wasn't really probably the right tool from the toolbox to begin with.
Right. In your book, you also adapted Why We Eat When We Eat, that exercise. Will you tell us about that?
Absolutely. I love that one. Okay, so Why We Eat What We Eat. That's from registered dietitian Lucy Aphramore, and she is the co-author of the book Body Respect with Dr. Linda Bacon. Mm-hmm. And by the way, her resource is in the very back of the book on page 188. It's called the Well Now approach. And she's based in London. But anyway, that information is there. And a few years ago I don't know if you've ever been to the EDRS conference.
I have
usually
not.
in Petaluma. It's kind of in Northern California. So Dr. Linda Bacon introduced Lucy Aphramore, and she spoke about this particular technique. And I don't know, it never left me. It really fascinated me. So she had to start off by thinking about how did we choose? So I don't know, it was probably late morning. It was a late morning talk, and she had us all thinking about, how did you choose the breakfast that you had this morning? Like, what was that about? And I thought, oh, interesting. I've never really thought about that. And I happened to I remember I had oats, whole oats. I almost said slow-cooked ones. That's funny. They're never slow-cooked for me. Like, that would have not been true. So let's say whole oats with quite a bit of honey, and that's what I had that particular morning. And if I had to answer that question about what was on my plate and why, which is kind of my version of her question, my answer would be habit. So I'm assuming it's habit because at that time I was in the habit of having the same thing for breakfast every morning for a while. I'll kind of do one thing until I can't do it ever again. So it'll be a while before I can do those again, if ever. So part of it was habit, I'm assuming. Secondly, it does carry me a little ways because of the whole oats. I like it with honey, with plenty of honey. And the other reason that it was on my plate was time. It's fast. Fast. And so it's a really fun exercise to do with clients. I had one client who took a trip to Disneyland with her family, and she sent me a picture of cotton candy. And it wasn't technically on a plate, but let's pretend it was on a plate. And so she was telling me, like, cotton candy, she takes this picture, what's on her plate and why. And her answer was nostalgia. So you just thinking about, like, why is it there? Is it health? Is it pleasure? Is it fun? Is it nostalgia? Is it bored? And I'll get a little more into one other idea, or I'll kind of segue into another part of this exercise. But what do you think about that before I go on?
I think that because diet culture is so rigid and toxic and harmful, that those reasons like nostalgia really get discounted instead of being recognized as that's a legitimate reason to eat something. And there's a way to do that is in peaceful and healthy relationship with that food. It's fine to eat something because it reminds you of childhood. It's those other things where we've already talked about in this episode where you're feeling disconnected, or it's a habit. It's the primary or only way that you're working through some feelings is to eat that food. That's very different than saying like, oh yeah, I remember when I had this at Disneyland when I was 7, and now that I'm 30, I want to have it again.
Right, exactly. So it's really fun to get clients. There's a cool quote, curiosity is the cure for a judgmental mind. So just get curious, like, interesting. I'm feeling this pull toward cotton candy and like, oh, nostalgia, and connecting it historically, And she has this great quote. It's basically, so she says, the current trend of choosing foods based mainly on nutrients discounts our likes, dislikes, taste, cravings, values, etc. It disconnects us from our body's signals, from social occasion, and ignores our circumstances. In this way, it teaches us a diet mentality of relating to food. So I just think that is just genius.
It's perfect.
And then she has this experiential exercise, and, I had my client took a stab at it and was gracious enough to offer it to me for the book. And so she has a couple of questions for that exercise, why we eat what we eat. And one is just even questions that I never thought about. Why do you choose one apple over another? I'm going to ask you, Janine, why do you choose the apples that you choose, unless you don't like apples and you don't choose any?
I love apples, and this is actually funny that's that particular food, because I am a person who is a diehard Honeycrisp apple fan, and I don't care that they're way more expensive. I really like the taste of them more, and it's worth it because I eat a bunch of apples. Also, I choose apples pretty frequently and like them, and my dog likes to share them with me, so I'll cut a little piece off and give him a piece too. But it's genuinely because I much prefer that. Like, I like the taste of that apple versus, like, I don't want to diss any other kinds of apples, but that's just my favorite. If I could pick anyone, that's the one I'm going to pick.
Yeah, and I'm with you, not necessarily on the same kind of apple, but Janine, diversity is the spice of life. It's all right. We can like different apples. It's all good.
We're still friends.
But I will travel so far for this Fuji apple that is at a market that here in Oakland. I don't know what the deal is and why their apples are better than any apples I've ever had, but I will go there for those apples, and I will stock up and pair them with cheese or with peanut butter. But mine would be similar to yours in that I will go the distance. I will pay the extra price. It's worth it to me, and I never get tired of them. But you can get a lot of information from people because some people, like in my caseload, some people will say, well, I get the big bag of this particular kind because of the cost. Or like my client that did the interview that's actually in the book, because it also depends on your age, right? I eat the apples that I eat because they're the ones that my parents get at the store, So just kind of keeping all of those things in mind. And the other thing that she asks with this exercise is why you choose particular foods on certain days of the week or the month or the year. And it's interesting because we're entering into Halloween is coming up next, but we're entering into the holidays. And one thing that my client brought up that I thought was such a good call that's seasonal is eggnog.
Yep.
And I don't know about you, but I also love those. The Fuyu persimmons are about to come out, and I can't wait for those. And just thinking about, it's fun to think about why we choose particular foods, certain weeks, days, months, times of year, just to kind of start to expand the way that we're thinking about food and the choices and not reducing it to nutrients only. We've not evolved to eat in that way. We're supposed to have pleasure with food.
Right. And that when we take the judgment that's from diet culture out of it, those reasons like something is seasonal, something is nostalgic can really improve our sense of connection with that food. I'm thinking about if I had something seasonal, like it would feel better for me to do that during the holiday season that I would want that in versus probably out of the blue. Like, no judgment toward eggnog. I like eggnog, but I've never had it in June. I've always had that in the winter.
Hey, Janine, it is not going to probably match your sweet tea.
It's probably not.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that changes with the season. And we crave different foods and different temperatures. And I think the basic takeaway there is you know what? We can all do our best to stock our fridge full of the foods that we know our body does really well with, experientially, trying not so much to make the decision from the chin up, does that make sense? Chin up. Dr. Jeb Burgard used that phrase initially, and I thought that was so cool. So doing our best to stock our fridge full of the foods that we know our body does really well with, and if we're being honest with ourselves, and also not freaking out when we want a cupcake.
Yeah.
Just
life necessitates cupcakes, I think. And I'm going to give a shout out to Carmen Cool. I want Carmen's feedback on that if she ever listens to this, because Carmen is an open cupcake enthusiast. So
yeah, and I've noticed that with this, as you get more and more practice at connected eating, you get quite a bit pickier about things like cupcakes. You're not messing around.
Right.
You want a good one.
Signe, we've covered so much good stuff about connected eating. Is there anything we haven't talked about that we want to get in there in these last few minutes?
No, you know what? I think that's a lot. That's probably a lot to take in, and that'll be kind of fun stuff to be thinking about.
Yeah.
Entering in, Halloween and the holidays, and I'm hoping that the audience will take away this idea of kind of swapping the strategy. So their strategy for food as we kind of enter into the holiday season. So instead of a diet mentality, kind of thinking more in terms of maybe arriving to a holiday party somewhere near appetite, getting exactly what it is that you want, stopping it just enough, and thinking about other things, like talking to people you haven't seen for a long time. And I just like kind of, instead of kind of staying away from the things that are really seasonal and special, actually looking forward to I don't get to have this food. It's not around except for during the holidays. I'm excited to go eat it,
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us about all this information. There's a bunch for people to think about and talk about in therapy and all of that. Of course, I'm going to link everything in the show notes so that people can connect with you. But if people want to learn more about you, where can they find you? Where can they find your book, No Way?
Oh, thanks, Janine. So the book No Way, WEIGH, of course, is with Jessica Kingsley Publishers, and they're based in London. And you can find it on Amazon or Barnes & Noble, or you can actually go to the Jessica Kingsley Publisher site and find it really easily there. And I have an Instagram account that's called No Way Guide, as well as my website that's all up to date that I just created. And the website is www.signedarpinian.com, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that anybody has there. But Janine, thank you so much for having me on the show.
Of course. Thanks, Signe. Thanks for joining me for another episode. Let's keep in touch. You can find all the information you need about the podcast at eatingdisorderrecoverypodcast.com, including full podcast episodes and links to all of our social media sites. You can join our Facebook group for the podcast by searching Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast on Facebook. This is a closed group for listeners of the podcast looking to connect, share resources, and get involved in a pro-recovery community. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, or YouTube. please leave us a review and let us know how we're doing. Talk to you next time on the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast.